They say betrayal isn't loud, it's quiet, like the crack of a thin plate breaking in a silent room. That night, under the dim light of my cramped New York apartment, I held a stack of shopping receipts with my name scrawled across them, bills for things I never bought. My own son was using my credit as if it were free money, stealing from me while I sat alone, forgotten and used. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Dorothy, and I'm 73 years old. Every morning, I wake up before dawn in this one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The cold concrete floor feels unforgiving beneath my worn pink slippers, the same ones my daughter gave me 3 Christmases ago, back when she still pretended to care. I shuffle to the tiny kitchen where the faint smell of stale coffee lingers from yesterday's pot, a ghostly reminder of mornings when my children gathered here, happy and alive with chatter and laughter that used to bounce off these thin walls. Now, the silence weighs heavy on my chest like a lead blanket I can't shake off. My days move in slow motion, a series of lonely tasks that stretch endlessly, sorting through bills with my failing eyesight, a little knitting while watching the same morning shows, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Ramirez from down the hall might stop by with her warm smile and stories about her grandchildren in Queens. But hope often dangles just out of reach, like the last apple on a tree I'm too old to climb. I remember when this apartment buzzed with life. When my husband Frank was alive, when our children Michael and Sarah would visit every Sunday for dinner, bringing their kids and filling these rooms with chaos and joy. The kitchen table groaned under the weight of my famous pot roast, and everyone fought over who got the last dinner roll. Frank would sit at the head of that table, his deep laugh echoing through our home, making everyone feel safe and loved. That was before the heart attack took him 5 years ago. Before the bills piled up. Before I learned what real loneliness felt like. That Thursday night in October, hoping for an apology or maybe just a word of care from Michael after we'd argued about money again, I glanced toward my small mailbox by the door, a pile of unopened letters and receipts I'd been avoiding for days. The weight of unpaid bills and financial worry pressed against my temples like a vice. My arthritic fingers stumbled over the latest credit card statement, the one I'd been dreading to open. And then, the shock hit me like ice water in my veins. Dozens of charges, all under my name, but from stores far outside the reach of my tiny Social Security budget. Whole Foods on the Upper East Side, $97 for groceries I never bought. Best Buy near Times Square, $843 for electronics I couldn't even name. Restaurant bills from places I'd never heard of, charging hundreds of dollars for meals while I survived on canned soup and day-old bread from the corner market. The name he once called Mom with such sweetness had become my own personal theft. My hands trembled as I spread the receipts across my small kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. Each purchase told a story of betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. Michael's favorite supermarket. The expensive steakhouse near his apartment in Brooklyn. The electronics store where he'd bought a new laptop, using my credit, my name, my rapidly shrinking financial security. I sat there in my threadbare nightgown, surrounded by evidence of my son's lies, and felt something inside me shatter. Not just my heart, that had been breaking slowly for years. Something deeper. My faith in the family I'd sacrificed everything to build and protect. For 37 years, I gave everything I had to my children. Even after Frank's funeral, when the medical bills from his final months drained our savings account down to nothing, I worked 3 part-time jobs to keep my grandchildren in warm winter coats and good schools. I cleaned offices at night after spending my days caring for elderly patients at a nursing home in Queens, then came home to babysit little Emma and Tyler while Michael and Sarah went out with their friends. Mom's credit is basically free money, Michael had joked once during a phone call last spring, only now I realized it wasn't a joke at all. It was a confession wrapped in cruelty, a window into how he really saw me. Not as his mother, not as a person with feelings and needs and dreams that mattered. Just as an ATM machine with gray hair and unconditional love. I lent him thousands over the years, no questions asked. When he lost his job at the shipping company, I covered 3 months of his rent without hesitation, dipping into the small inheritance Frank's mother had left us. When his car broke down, I paid for repairs that cost more than I spent on food in 6 months. When Sarah's marriage fell apart and she needed money for a lawyer, I liquidated the modest stock portfolio Frank had built for our retirement, turning our future security into her temporary relief. Every time, I swallowed my pride and said the same words, "It's okay, sweetheart. Family comes first." But family, I was learning, was supposed to work both ways. I remember the cold silences that followed whenever I gently asked, "Do you think you'll be able to pay me back soon?" Michael's eyes would dart away from mine, focusing on his phone or the television or anything that meant he didn't have to look at the worry lines etched deeper into my face with each unpaid debt. The silence would swallow the room whole, leaving me feeling smaller and more invisible than before. His forgiveness requests became my prison. You don't understand what I'm going through, he'd say repeatedly, each word carefully chosen to turn my love into guilt. You don't know how hard it is to find decent work these days. You don't get how expensive everything has become. You're retired, you have time to worry about money. I'm trying to build a life here. And slowly, drop by painful drop, I began to doubt myself. Was I being unreasonable? Was I just a bank account to him, a convenience when times got tough, or worse, was I completely forgotten when times were good? When was the last time he called just to ask how I was feeling? When was the last time either of my children had visited without needing something from me? The manipulation was so gradual, so expertly crafted, that I didn't recognize it as abuse until that night with the receipts spread before me like evidence in a courtroom. Each, you don't understand, had been a brick in the wall he built between us, keeping me from seeing the truth, that my love had become his income, and my trust had become his credit line. But the receipts didn't lie. Numbers don't manipulate or gaslight or make you question your own reality. 8 months of unauthorized purchases, totaling over $4,000, money I didn't have, debt in my name for things that never crossed the threshold of my tiny apartment. I thought about my empty refrigerator, the medical bills I'd been putting off, the winter coat I needed but couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Michael had been living comfortably on my stolen credit, buying steaks and gadgets and restaurant meals while I rationed my arthritis medication to make it last longer. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the casualness of it all. He hadn't even tried to hide the charges or make up stories about emergencies. He'd simply taken what he wanted, confident that his mother would never fight back, never stand up for herself, never say no to the son who'd learned to weaponize her love against her own well-being. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while sirens wailed in the distance and the city hummed its restless song outside my window. My mind raced through memories, re-examining every conversation, every request for help, every moment I'd felt something was wrong but pushed the feeling aside because I wanted so desperately to believe in the family I'd raised. I remembered Michael's childhood, how he used to crawl into bed with Frank and me during thunderstorms, his little body shaking with fear until we wrapped him in warmth and safety. I remembered teaching him to ride his first bicycle in Central Park, running alongside him with my hand on his back, promising I wouldn't let go until he was ready. I remembered his graduation from high school, how proud we were when he walked across that stage, the first person in our family to finish school without dropping out. Where had that sweet, vulnerable boy gone? When had he learned to see his mother as something to exploit rather than someone to cherish? The next few days passed in a fog of disbelief and heartbreak. I canceled my credit cards and reported the fraud to the bank, sitting on hold for hours while automated voices assured me that my call was important to them. The representative who finally spoke to me was kind but clinical, walking me through the process of filing a police report and disputing the charges. "Ma'am, I have to ask, do you have any idea who might have access to your credit information?" the woman asked gently. I closed my eyes and felt tears I'd been holding back for days finally spill over. "Yes," I whispered into the phone. "I think it was my son." The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy with judgment, though I knew the representative had probably heard similar stories countless times. Elder financial abuse, they called it. Such clinical words for such a personal devastation. Birthdays had started slipping by without so much as a phone call from either of my children. My 72nd birthday last year came and went in complete silence, no cards, no flowers, no acknowledgement that I'd survived another year on this earth. I spent that evening sitting alone in this apartment, eating a piece of grocery store sheet cake and singing "Happy Birthday" to myself in a voice that cracked with loneliness. When my arthritis worsened last winter, making it difficult to walk to the corner market or carry groceries up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, I waited days for anyone to check in on me. I called Michael twice, leaving voicemails that went unreturned. I sent Sarah text messages that disappeared into the digital void without so much as a read receipt. The sharp sting of loneliness became more constant than the physical pain in my joints. At least the arthritis responded to ibuprofen and heat pads. The ache of abandonment had no cure I could find at the pharmacy. Mrs. Ramirez started checking on me during those difficult weeks, bringing me soup her daughter had made and helping me carry my laundry to the building's basement washing machines. She never asked questions about why my own children weren't there to help, but I could see the concern in her dark eyes, the way she looked around my quiet apartment as if searching for signs of the family that should have been present during my struggle. Then came that stack of receipts, and suddenly everything clicked into place with terrible clarity. The reality crashed over me like a wave of ice water. My name printed on every single charge, extravagant dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford to look at through their windows, expensive electronic gadgets that cost more than my monthly rent, luxury groceries while I survived on generic brands and day-old bread. None of it for me. All of it stolen from my future, my security, my peace of mind. In a burst of silent fury and heartbreak that surprised me with its intensity, I swept the receipts off the table and watched them flutter to the floor like autumn leaves. Then, moving as if in a dream, I picked up the delicate china cup Frank's sister had given us for our wedding, one of the few beautiful things I had left, and hurled it against the kitchen sink. The crash was satisfying and terrifying all at once. The pieces scattered across the floor like fragments of my shattered trust, sharp and irreparable. Tears traced the wrinkles of my cheeks, burning like acid as they fell, but inside me, something else was stirring. A tiny defiant spark that I hadn't felt in years. What was I so afraid of? Saying no to my own blood? Setting boundaries with the children I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally? Why did the thought of standing up for myself fill me with such terror? But loneliness whispered back like a cruel companion that had taken up permanent residence in my heart. If I confronted Michael about the theft, if I demanded respect instead of acceptance, would I lose him completely? Would I end up dying alone in this apartment, with no one to notice until the smell alerted the neighbors? The fear was real and sharp, but for the first time in months, it wasn't the only emotion I felt. Anger burned alongside the fear, righteous and clean. I deserved better than this. I deserved honesty from my children. I deserved to have my name and my credit and my trust treated with respect. I spent that evening packing the old photo album away, unable to look at pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings that now felt like lies. Every smile in every photograph seemed fake, every hug appeared calculated, every "I love you, Mom" felt hollow and manipulative. Then I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me had silver hair and deep lines around her eyes, but she also had something I'd forgotten she possessed: strength. This was the same woman who'd raised 2 children while working full-time, who'd nursed her husband through his final illness without complaint, who'd survived the Great Recession and 9/11 and decades of challenges that would have broken someone weaker. When had I started believing I was powerless? The next morning, I called Michael. My hands shook as I dialed his number, but my voice was steadier than it had been in months. "Mom? What's wrong?" he answered, and I realized with a pang that he only expected bad news from me now. I was just a source of problems to solve or money to borrow, not a person he enjoyed talking to. "I need to see you," I said simply. "Today." "I'm kind of busy, Michael." I interrupted him, surprising us both. "I need to see you today. We need to talk." Something in my tone must have penetrated his usual wall of casual dismissal because he agreed to come over that evening after work. I spent the day preparing for a conversation I'd never imagined having with one of my children. I organized the receipts into neat piles, arranged by date and amount. I made copies of everything. I researched my rights as a victim of credit card fraud. I practiced what I would say in front of the bathroom mirror until the words stopped sticking in my throat. When Michael arrived that evening, he looked exactly like the successful young man I'd always hoped he'd become. Well-dressed in a tailored suit, carrying the leather briefcase I'd bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, checking his expensive phone as he walked through my door. He looked prosperous and confident and completely oblivious to the devastation he'd caused. "So what's this about, Mom?" he asked, settling onto my worn couch without really looking at me. "I can't stay long, I've got plans tonight." I placed the stack of receipts on the coffee table between us like a deck of cards revealing my hand in a game I'd never agreed to play. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. No surprise. No confusion. No innocent questions about what these papers were or where they'd come from. Just a slight tightening around his eyes and a defensive shift in his posture. "We need to talk about these," I said quietly. "Mom, you don't understand." There it was. The same phrase he always used to shut down my concerns and make me doubt my own perceptions. But this time, I didn't let it work. "No, Michael. You don't understand." My voice was stronger now, fed by months of accumulated hurt and the clear evidence spread before us. "These are charges on my credit cards. Charges I didn't make. For things I never bought. Your name might not be on these receipts, but I know who made these purchases." He tried several tactics. First came denial: "I have no idea what you're talking about." Then came deflection: "Why would you even think I'd do something like that?" Finally came the manipulation I'd grown so tired of hearing: "I can't believe you'd accuse me of stealing from you. I'm your son." But the receipts didn't lie, and for once, I didn't let his emotional manipulation cloud my judgment. "Show me your wallet," I said calmly. "What? Mom, you're being ridiculous." "Show me your wallet, Michael." After several more minutes of protests and deflection, he finally pulled out his leather wallet and opened it reluctantly. There, tucked behind his driver's license, was a credit card with my name on it. "Mom, I can explain, you stole from me." The words came out quiet but solid, like stones dropped into still water. "For months, you've been stealing from me while I worried about paying my own bills. While I rationed my medication to make it last longer. While I ate canned soup for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries." I watched his face cycle through emotions: guilt, anger, defiance, self-pity. But never remorse. Never genuine regret for the pain he'd caused or the trust he'd destroyed. "It was just temporary," he finally said. I was going to pay it back. Things have been tight at work, and I knew you wouldn't mind helping out, without asking me? Without even telling me? This isn't helping out, Michael. This is theft. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael alternating between justifications and attempts to make me feel guilty for confronting him. He painted himself as the victim, struggling with work stress, trying to build a life, dealing with financial pressures I couldn't possibly understand. But I'd heard it all before, and the receipts made his excuses ring hollow. $4,000 wasn't a small, temporary mistake. It was systematic theft that had been going on for 8 months while I kept quiet about my own struggles and sacrifice. When he finally left that night, making vague promises to make things right, without specifying how or when, I felt both relieved and terrified. I'd spoken truth to power, but power in this case was my own son, and I wasn't sure what the consequences would be. The next morning, I called Sarah to tell her what had happened with Michael. I thought she might be shocked or sympathetic or at least willing to listen as I tried to process the betrayal and figure out what to do next. Instead, she immediately took her brother's side. "Mom, you're just confused," she said, her tone cold as the steel fire escape outside my kitchen window. "You're tired and stressed, and you're looking for someone to blame for your problems. Michael wouldn't steal from you. You're being paranoid." The word paranoid hit me like a slap across the face. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep through countless nightmares, dismissing my pain and gaslighting my reality as if I were a senile old woman who couldn't trust her own perceptions. "Sarah, I have the receipts. I have the proof. Maybe you gave him permission and just forgot. Maybe he's been using the card for family expenses and you got confused about it. You're 73, Mom. Memory problems are normal at your age." I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as I listened to my daughter systematically invalidate my experience and dismiss my intelligence. She made it clear that supporting Michael was more important to her than acknowledging my pain or seeking the truth. When I tried to explain the financial strain the stolen charges had put on my budget, Sarah interrupted with impatience. "Mom, if money is such a problem, maybe it's time to think about moving somewhere smaller. Or maybe look into one of those nice assisted living places where you won't have to worry about managing your own finances." The suggestion was so casually cruel that I almost dropped the phone. In her mind, the solution to her brother stealing from me wasn't for him to stop stealing, it was for me to give up my independence and agency entirely, to become a ward of some institution where my finances would be managed by strangers. My ex-husband Richard, who I'd invited to Sunday dinner hoping he might provide some perspective or support, stayed conspicuously silent during the entire conversation with both children. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd made decisions about our family for 28 years of marriage, and said nothing while our children dismissed and invalidated their mother. His silence felt like another betrayal, passive but just as damaging as his children's act of cruelty. Only my younger grandson Tyler seemed uncomfortable with the family's response to my situation. At 19, he shifted awkwardly between loyalties, caught between his father and grandmother, clearly sensing something was wrong but lacking the power or courage to speak up. I caught him looking at me with something that might have been compassion, but he said nothing when it might have mattered most. That evening, after everyone had left and I sat alone with the weight of my family's response, Mrs. Ramirez knocked on my door. Elena Ramirez was 78 years old, a Puerto Rican widow who'd lived in New York for over half her life. She'd raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived more than her share of challenges. "Dorothy, Mija," she said softly, settling into the chair by my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. "I heard some raised voices earlier. Are you okay?" Something about her genuine concern, so different from my own family's dismissive responses, opened the floodgates I'd been trying to hold back. I told her everything, about the stolen credit charges, about Michael's lack of remorse, about Sarah's gaslighting, about Richard's silence, about the terrible loneliness of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me most. Elena listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes filled with understanding and righteous anger on my behalf. "You deserve more than this pain," she said finally. "Your children have forgotten who raised them, who sacrificed for their happiness, who loved them before they could even speak. But their forgetting doesn't erase your worth, Dorothy. You are a good mother who raised ungrateful children, and that's their failure, not yours." Her words were like cool water on a burn I'd been carrying for months. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone believed me. Someone saw my pain as real and valid. Someone treated me with the respect I'd forgotten I deserved. What should I do? I asked her, feeling like a child seeking guidance from someone wiser. "You should protect yourself," Elena said simply. "You should remember that you matter, not just as someone's mother or someone's source of money, but as Dorothy, a woman with her own rights and needs and dreams. And you should stop giving your pearls to people who treat them like they're worthless." That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in decades, I refused to give them what they wanted from me. No more bailout calls from Michael would be answered with automatic agreement. No more manipulation from Sarah would be met with guilty compliance. No more family emergencies would result in me emptying my bank account or compromising my own security. I reported the fraud to my credit card company officially, providing them with copies of all the receipts and documentation I'd gathered. I also called the police non-emergency line to file a report about the identity theft, even though the officer who took my statement warned me that prosecuting family members for financial crimes was complicated and rarely resulted in jail time. But it creates a paper trail, he explained kindly. And sometimes that's what it takes for people to understand you're serious about protecting yourself. The process was humbling and empowering all at once. I had to admit to strangers that my own son had been stealing from me, had to sign documents that made the betrayal official and legal. But I also felt agency for the first time in months, like I was finally taking action to protect myself instead of just absorbing abuse and hoping things would somehow get better on their own. That first night after reporting the fraud was the first peaceful sleep I'd had in years. No anxiety crushing my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. No racing thoughts about unpaid bills or family obligations or the fear that I wasn't doing enough for people who didn't appreciate my sacrifices. The city noises filtered in through my thin windows, sirens wailing in the distance, the rumble of late-night subway trains, distant laughter from the bar down the street, but none of it could disturb this new silence inside my heart. For decades, I'd fallen asleep worried about other people's problems and other people's needs. Now I was learning what it felt like to fall asleep focused on my own well-being, my own safety, my own peace of mind. The next morning, I took the subway to the credit monitoring office in Brooklyn, my hands trembling with nervousness but my spine straight with pride. The building was sterile and bureaucratic, filled with fluorescent lights and worn carpeting, but every small step I took there, filling out forms, explaining my story to patient representatives, signing documents that would protect my financial identity, felt like breaking free from invisible chains that had bound me for years. I was clumsy with some of the paperwork, my arthritis making it difficult to write clearly, my inexperience with financial systems making some of the language confusing. But I was determined, and the people helping me were kind and professional, treating me like a person whose problems mattered instead of an inconvenience to be managed. Mrs. Patterson, the fraud specialist told me as we wrapped up the appointment, I want you to know that what happened to you is unfortunately common, and it's never your fault. Family financial abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America because victims often feel too ashamed or guilty to seek help. You did the right thing by coming forward. Those words meant more to me than I could express. Someone in authority was telling me that I wasn't paranoid or confused or vindictive. I was a victim of a real crime, and I deserved protection and support. Over the following days, I began to notice changes in how I felt and moved through my daily routine. My shoulders weren't constantly tensed against the next crisis call from Michael. My stomach didn't clench every time the phone rang. I started eating regular meals again instead of just snacking on crackers and worry. But the real test was still coming. 3 weeks later, Michael called to demand a family meeting. His voice on the phone was tight with anger and something that sounded like panic. "Mom, we need to talk. All of us. This fraud report thing you filed, it's causing problems. Sarah thinks you're having some kind of breakdown, and Richard wants to discuss your living situation. We're all worried about you." The manipulation was so transparent that I almost laughed. Now, suddenly, they were all worried about me, not when I'd been struggling financially because of Michael's theft, not when I'd been eating soup for dinner for months, not when I'd been rationing my medication. Only now, when their financial access to me was threatened, did I become worthy of their concern. "Fine," I said calmly. Sunday afternoon. 2 o'clock. I spent that week preparing for what I suspected would be an intervention designed to manipulate me back into my old role as the family's financial resource. I organized my documentation, researched my rights as a fraud victim, and most importantly, I practiced staying calm and centered regardless of what emotional tactics they might use against me. Sunday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October chill that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. My small living room had never felt more cramped than it did that afternoon, with 4 adults arranged in chairs that suddenly seemed too close together. Michael sat across from me, his jaw set with determination and entitlement. Sarah perched on the edge of her chair like she was ready to flee at the first sign of conflict. Richard slouched in the corner, still maintaining his position of strategic neutrality. The intervention began exactly as I'd expected, with Sarah taking the role of concerned daughter addressing my supposed mental decline. "Mom, we're all worried about you," she said in a voice that managed to sound both caring and condescending. "This paranoia about Michael stealing from you, these wild accusations, this vindictive behavior with the police reports, it's not like you. We think the isolation might be affecting your judgment. Michael jumped in with his own version of concern. You're living alone in this apartment, you're not eating right, you're obviously confused about finances. Maybe it's time to consider some kind of assisted living situation where professionals can help you manage your daily needs. The choreography of their manipulation was almost impressive. They'd clearly planned this approach, dividing roles between them like actors in a play designed to make me doubt my own sanity and surrender my independence. Richard's continued silence served as a kind of quiet endorsement of their position. But I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, and I was no longer the broken, confused woman they expected to manipulate. I'm not confused, I said clearly, placing the stack of receipts back on the coffee table between us. I'm not paranoid. And I'm not having a breakdown. I'm responding appropriately to being robbed by my own son. Michael's face flushed with anger. You're just mad because I didn't ask permission before borrowing money you weren't even using. You're sitting on savings while I'm trying to build a career and support my future family. Borrowing? I interrupted him, feeling a surge of anger so clean and pure it surprised me. You didn't borrow anything, Michael. Borrowing requires asking permission and making arrangements to pay back what you've taken. What you did was steal. What you did was commit fraud. What you did was abuse my trust and exploit my love to fund your lifestyle while I struggled to pay for my own medication. The room went very quiet. I could hear Mrs. Ramirez's television through the thin walls, the rumble of Sunday traffic on the street below, the tick of the small clock on my kitchen counter. But from my family, complete silence. Sarah tried again. Mom, you're being dramatic. Michael made some mistakes, but you're blowing this out of proportion. Families help each other, families also respect each other, I said, standing up and walking to the small mantelpiece where I kept our family photos. My hands were steady as I picked up our last family portrait, Christmas 2 years ago. Everyone gathered around the tree Frank and I had decorated together for decades, all of us smiling at the camera like we still believed in the love we were pretending to share. I held the photo for a moment, remembering the woman I used to be. The woman who'd treasured this image, who'd believed that the smiles were real and the love was mutual and the family she'd built would protect and cherish her in her old age just as she'd protected and cherished all of them when they were vulnerable. Then, very deliberately, I tore the photograph in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the room like a scream. Sarah gasped. Michael jumped to his feet. Richard finally showed some emotion, his face registering shock at seeing me destroy something he knew I'd treasured. But I wasn't finished. I walked to the small safe Frank had installed in our bedroom closet years ago, the one where we'd kept important documents and the modest amount of jewelry I owned. With my family watching in stunned silence, I placed my credit cards, my checkbook, and my identification inside the safe and locked it with the combination only I knew. I will no longer buy love, I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the small apartment. I will no longer fund disrespect. I will no longer allow my name and my credit and my financial security to be treated as community property for people who can't even be bothered to call me on my birthday. I turned to face them, feeling taller somehow despite my 73 years and arthritis-bent spine. Respect me or lose me. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in sand that had been shifting beneath my feet for too long. This was my declaration of independence, my refusal to continue funding my own abuse, my decision to matter in my own life. Michael's response was immediate and telling. You're just doing this for attention. You want us to beg and grovel and tell you how wonderful you are. Well, I'm not playing these games, Mom. I won't be manipulated by guilt trips and dramatic scenes. But Sarah's reaction was more complex, flickering between anger and something that looked almost like respect. She stared at the torn photograph on the coffee table, then at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Richard finally spoke. Dorothy, don't you think you're being a bit extreme? Extreme? I repeated, feeling a laugh build in my chest that held no humor whatsoever. Richard, I've been extremely patient. I've been extremely forgiving. I've been extremely generous and extremely understanding and extremely willing to sacrifice my own well-being for ungrateful people who see me as nothing more than a source of money they're entitled to spend. I looked around the room at these 3 people I'd loved and supported and prioritized for decades, seeing them clearly for who they really were instead of who I desperately hoped they might become. What's extreme is stealing $4,000 from your own mother. What's extreme is gaslighting someone who's trying to protect herself from financial abuse. What's extreme is suggesting that someone should give up their independence and move to assisted living because they refuse to keep funding their own exploitation. The confrontation continued for another hour, with various attempts at emotional manipulation, threats disguised as concern, and promises they had no intention of keeping. But something fundamental had shifted in me during that moment when I tore up the photograph. I was no longer afraid of their anger or their disapproval or even their abandonment. For the first time in my adult life, I was more afraid of continuing to live without self-respect than I was of living without their conditional love. When they finally left that evening, making vague threats about getting me help and talking to someone about your behavior, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. I'd stood up to them. I'd drawn boundaries. I'd refused to let them define my reality or dictate my worth. But I also knew this wasn't over. People who've grown accustomed to exploiting someone don't usually accept the loss of that supply gracefully. 2 weeks later, Elena knocked on my door with a look of concern I'd learned to recognize. "Dorothy, Mija, I think you need to see this." She handed me her tablet, open to Facebook. There, posted on Michael's page for all the world to see, was a long, emotional post about his supposedly declining mother who'd become paranoid and vindictive in her old age. The post painted a picture of me as a bitter, confused elderly woman who didn't understand modern family dynamics and was lashing out at children who only wanted to help her. According to Michael's version of events, I'd accused him of theft because I couldn't remember giving him permission to use my credit cards. I'd filed false police reports because I was desperate for attention. I'd become impossible to reason with and was burning family bridges because of mental decline that made me suspicious and cruel. The comments section was filled with sympathy for my poor son, having to deal with such an unreasonable and ungrateful mother. Friends and acquaintances who didn't know me personally expressed their support for Michael and their concern about elderly people who become difficult as they age. It was character assassination disguised as concern, a public lynching designed to isolate me from any potential support and paint my legitimate self-defense as the ravings of a senile woman. The public lie cut deeper, in some ways, than the original theft had. Michael wasn't content to steal from me privately, he needed to destroy my reputation publicly to protect himself from any consequences of his actions. He was willing to sacrifice my dignity and social connections to maintain his image as a devoted son struggling with an impossible mother. But this time, the pain was different. Sharp and clean instead of dull and confusing. I read through the post twice, absorbed the cruelty of it, acknowledged the attempt to isolate and shame me into submission. And then I closed the tablet and handed it back to Elena. "What are you going to do?" she asked, watching my face for signs of the devastation Michael had undoubtedly hoped to cause. "Nothing," I said simply. "Nothing?" "Nothing," I repeated, surprised by how calm I felt. "I'm not going to defend myself to strangers on the internet. I'm not going to engage in a public argument with my son. I'm not going to dignify his lies with any response at all." Elena studied my face carefully. "Are you okay?" I thought about the question seriously. Was I okay? My son had stolen from me, gaslighted me, and then tried to destroy my reputation when I refused to continue being his victim. My daughter had dismissed my pain and suggested I give up my independence rather than expect her brother to behave honestly. My ex-husband had remained complicitly silent through it all. By any objective measure, I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. "I'm more than okay," I told Elena. "I'm free." And I was. Free from the need to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I had none. Free from the obligation to fund people who saw me as an ATM with emotions. Free from the exhausting work of trying to maintain relationships with people who only valued what I could do for them, never who I was as a person. Michael's public lies didn't diminish me because I no longer required his approval to know my own worth. His attempt to isolate me couldn't succeed because I was finally learning to enjoy my own company. His manipulation had no power over someone who was no longer afraid of his disapproval. That realization marked the beginning of what I now think of as my real rebirth. The next week, Elena invited me to join her pottery class in Queens. I'd never worked with clay in my life, never considered myself artistic or creative in any way. But there was something appealing about the idea of making something beautiful with my own hands, something that belonged to me completely and couldn't be stolen or devalued or used against me. The class met every Wednesday afternoon in a small studio near the 7 train, filled with women of various ages and backgrounds who gathered to learn something new together. Our instructor was a patient woman in her 50s named Carmen who treated every attempt, no matter how clumsy, as worthy of encouragement. The first time I touched clay, I understood why people found pottery therapeutic. The material was responsive and forgiving, willing to be shaped and reshaped until you found the form you were looking for. My arthritic hands, so painful when I tried to write or carry groceries, felt capable and strong as they worked the clay into simple bowls and cups. "Don't worry about making it perfect," Carmen told us during that first session. "Clay teaches you to embrace the imperfections. The cracks and irregularities are what make each piece unique and beautiful." I thought about my own life, all the cracks and imperfections I'd spent so many years trying to hide or fix or apologize for. Maybe they weren't flaws that needed to be corrected. Maybe they were what made me uniquely myself, evidence of the pressures I'd survived and the strength I'd developed through surviving them. Over the following weeks, I found myself smiling more in those few hours at pottery class than I had in the entire previous year. There was something deeply satisfying about creating rather than just maintaining, about building something up rather than constantly giving pieces of yourself away. The other women in the class became my first real social connections in years. We shared stories about our lives, our families, our dreams for retirement. Some were dealing with challenges similar to mine: adult children who took advantage of their generosity, marriages that had drained rather than sustained them, the struggle to rediscover their own identity after decades of defining themselves through service to others. But there was no judgment in this group, no competition or manipulation. Just women supporting other women as we all worked to create something beautiful from raw materials and patient effort. I started looking forward to Wednesdays with the kind of anticipation I hadn't felt since childhood. Elena would meet me at the subway station, and we'd ride together to Queens, talking about whatever came to mind without worrying about hidden agendas or careful phrasing designed to avoid conflict. For the first time in years, I was spending time with people who enjoyed my company rather than just tolerating it while they figured out how to get what they wanted from me. Around the same time, I began reaching out to old friends I'd lost touch with during the years when my family consumed all my emotional energy and financial resources. Margaret, who'd been my closest friend when our children were small, welcomed me back into her life as if no time had passed at all. We started meeting for coffee once a week, sharing stories about grandchildren and health challenges and the strange liberation that came with no longer having to pretend our families were perfect. I reconnected with women from the church Frank and I used to attend, joining their weekly Bible study not because I was particularly religious but because I craved the fellowship and intellectual stimulation of discussing meaningful topics with thoughtful people. Slowly, my world began to expand beyond the narrow confines of family obligation and financial worry. I remembered interests I'd abandoned, dreams I'd deferred, parts of myself I'd forgotten existed during the years when I defined myself entirely through my relationships with people who'd grown to see me as expendable. My apartment began to reflect these changes. I bought fresh flowers every week, not expensive arrangements, just cheerful daisies or seasonal blooms from the corner market that made my small space feel more alive. I hung 2 of my pottery pieces on the wall, imperfect bowls that caught the afternoon light and reminded me that I could create beauty instead of just cleaning up other people's messes. I started dressing in brighter colors, reds and blues and cheerful yellows instead of the muted grays and beiges I'd been wearing for years. When I saw myself in mirrors now, I looked like a person who mattered in her own life instead of someone who existed solely to serve others. Most surprisingly, I discovered I enjoyed my own company in ways I'd never expected. Evenings alone in my apartment were no longer empty stretches of loneliness to endure but peaceful opportunities to read books I chose, watch movies I enjoyed, or simply sit quietly with my thoughts without someone else's crisis demanding my immediate attention. The financial situation resolved itself more easily than I dared hope. The credit card company removed all the fraudulent charges from my account and issued me new cards with enhanced security features. The small amount of savings I'd been afraid to spend on my own needs became available for simple pleasures: better food, a comfortable reading chair, the pottery classes that had become such an important part of my routine. For the first time in my adult life, I was spending money on my own happiness without guilt or fear that I might need those resources for someone else's emergency instead. But the most profound change was internal. The constant anxiety that had been my companion for years began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence I'd never known I possessed. I started expressing opinions I might have kept to herself before, setting boundaries I wouldn't have dared enforce when I was afraid of losing people's approval. When a telemarketer tried to pressure me into buying something I didn't want, I hung up instead of listening politely to the entire sales pitch. When my doctor's office tried to schedule appointments at times that were inconvenient for me, I asked for alternatives instead of rearranging my life around their preferences. Small acts of self-advocacy that might seem insignificant to someone who'd always felt entitled to respect and consideration, but they were revolutionary for a woman who'd spent decades believing that other people's needs mattered more than her own comfort or preferences. 3 months after the final confrontation with my family, I received a text message from Michael that simply said, "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" I read the message several times, waiting for the mix of hope and anxiety that such communications used to trigger. Instead, I felt only a mild curiosity about what had prompted this apparent change of heart. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with the message for several days, discussing it with Elena and Margaret, thinking about what I wanted from any potential reconciliation and whether I believed Michael's apology was genuine or just another manipulation tactic designed to restore his access to my resources. Finally, I replied, "I'm willing to listen if you're ready to take full responsibility for what you did and make concrete changes in how you treat me." His response came quickly, "Can I come over? I want to explain everything in person." "We can meet at the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue," I wrote back. 1 o'clock on Saturday. I chose a public location deliberately. I wanted to discuss this situation somewhere neutral, without the emotional weight of our family history pressing down on us from every photograph and piece of furniture in my apartment. I also wanted witnesses around, other people whose presence would encourage both of us to keep the conversation civil and focused. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, one of those October days in New York when the air feels sharp with possibility and change. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early, choosing a table where I could see the door and feeling more prepared for this conversation than I'd felt for any family interaction in years. Michael appeared prompt at 1 o'clock, looking different somehow. Less polished than usual, more uncertain. He'd lost some weight, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom," he said as he sat down across from me, "I owe you a huge apology." "Yes," I agreed simply, "you do." He seemed surprised by my directness, as if he'd expected me to rush in with reassurances that everything was fine and we could just forget the whole unpleasant business. But I'd spent 3 months learning to value my own perspective, and I wasn't going to minimize his betrayal just to make him feel more comfortable. "I've been talking to a counselor," he continued, "about everything that happened. About the way I've been treating you. About why I thought it was okay to take money without asking." This was more promising than I'd expected. The Michael I'd raised would never have sought professional help or admitted to needing guidance about his behavior. "What did you learn?" I asked neutrally. He took a deep breath, clearly having rehearsed this conversation but still struggling with the actual expression of accountability. "I learned that I was taking advantage of your love for me. That I was treating you like an ATM instead of like my mother. That I convinced myself you owed me support because you were my parent, without ever thinking about what you might need or want for yourself." I listened without interrupting, evaluating his words for sincerity versus manipulation. This sounded different from his previous attempts at reconciliation, more specific, less focused on my supposed overreaction and more focused on his actual behavior. "The counselor helped me understand that what I did wasn't borrowing money without permission," he continued. "It was theft. It was financial abuse. And then when you stood up for yourself, I tried to make everyone think you were crazy instead of admitting what I'd done." These were words I'd never heard from Michael before: theft, abuse, accountability. Someone had clearly helped him understand the reality of the situation in ways he'd been unable or unwilling to see before. "What do you want from this conversation?" I asked him directly. "I want to make things right," he said. "I want to pay back every penny I stole from you. I want to rebuild your trust, if that's possible. I want to have a real relationship with you, not one where I'm always asking for money or taking advantage of your kindness." I studied his face across the small coffee shop table, looking for signs of the manipulative tactics I'd grown so familiar with over the years. But he seemed genuinely uncomfortable in a way that suggested real shame rather than performance designed to achieve a specific result. "Michael," I said carefully, "I appreciate this apology. It sounds more honest than anything you've said to me in years. But apologies are just words. What matters is whether your behavior actually changes." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm already working on paying you back. I've set up a payment plan with my bank, and I can start sending you $300 a month until everything is covered." I deleted the Facebook post and posted an apology explaining that I was wrong about everything I said. "And I want to start over with our relationship. No more asking for money, no more treating you like you exist just to solve my problems." The specificity of his proposals impressed me. This wasn't just vague promises to do better, but concrete plans that would cost him something and benefit me. "What about Sarah?" I asked. "And your father?" Michael's expression grew uncomfortable. "Sarah is still angry about the whole situation. She thinks I'm overreacting by going to counseling and that you manipulated me into feeling guilty. Dad just wants everyone to get along without dealing with any of the actual problems." This matched my own assessment of my family dynamics. Sarah was still invested in the old system where I absorbed abuse without complaining, and Richard was still committed to conflict avoidance regardless of who got hurt in the process. "I can only control my own behavior," Michael continued. "But I wanted you to know that I understand now how badly I hurt you, and I want to earn your forgiveness if you're willing to give me that chance." I sat quietly for several minutes, weighing his words against years of broken promises and manipulative behavior. The skeptical part of me wondered if this was just a more sophisticated attempt to restore his access to my financial resources. But the counselor reference suggested he'd invested time and money in understanding his own behavior, which was more than he'd ever done before. "I'm willing to try," I said finally. "But this has to be different from our old relationship. I won't go back to being someone you only call when you need something. I won't restart the pattern where my worth to you is measured by what I can do for you instead of who I am as a person." "I understand," he said. "I want it to be different too. I want to know about your life, about your pottery classes and your friends and what you're doing for yourself. I want to be someone who adds good things to your life instead of just taking from it." We talked for another hour, establishing ground rules for any potential reconciliation. No requests for money for at least a year, and after that only genuine emergencies discussed in advance rather than sudden demands. Regular contact that wasn't crisis-driven, phone calls just to chat, occasional visits that didn't involve him needing something from me. Respect for my boundaries and decisions without arguments or manipulation. Most importantly, he would need to demonstrate sustained change in his behavior rather than just promising to change and then reverting to old patterns when he thought I'd forgiven him enough to tolerate more exploitation. When we parted that afternoon, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in years about the possibility of having a genuine relationship with my son. But I was no longer desperate for his approval or terrified of his abandonment, which meant I could approach any reconciliation from a position of strength rather than need. Whether our relationship could be rebuilt would depend entirely on his willingness to follow through on his commitments over time. But my well-being no longer depended on that outcome, which freed me to hope for the best while still protecting myself from further harm. That evening, Elena came over to hear about the conversation over dinner. I cooked a real meal for the first time in months, chicken with vegetables and fresh bread from the bakery down the street, followed by tea and the small cookies we both enjoyed. "How do you feel about it?" she asked as we cleaned up the dishes together, our easy friendship making even mundane tasks feel companionable. "Hopeful but careful," I said honestly. He sounded different. More grown up, maybe. But I've heard apologies from him before, and they never lasted long enough to mean anything. "The difference this time," Elena observed, "is that you don't need his apology to be okay. You've learned to be happy without his approval. So if he follows through on his promises, that's wonderful. But if he doesn't, you'll still be fine." She was exactly right. The old Dorothy would have grabbed onto Michael's apology like a lifeline, desperate to restore family harmony regardless of whether the underlying problems had actually been addressed. This new version of me could appreciate his efforts without rebuilding my entire emotional foundation on the hope that he'd finally learn to treat me with respect. 6 months later, Michael's behavior had indeed changed in ways that surprised me. He called every Sunday just to chat about our respective weeks, sharing stories about his work and asking about my pottery classes and social activities. He sent flowers on my birthday, not expensive arrangements, but thoughtful choices that showed he'd remembered my favorite colors. When his car needed repairs, he handled the financial crisis himself instead of calling me for rescue. Most significantly, he seemed genuinely interested in my life as something more than a source of support for his own needs. He asked about Margaret and Elena, remembered details about my pottery projects, expressed enthusiasm when I told him about books I'd read or places I'd visited with friends. It felt like talking to the son I'd always hoped he might become, someone who saw me as a whole person worthy of consideration and care, rather than just a resource to be managed or exploited. Sarah, on the other hand, maintained her distance and disapproval. She had not apologized for her role in gaslighting my legitimate complaints about Michael's theft, nor had she acknowledged the cruelty of suggesting I give up my independence rather than expect her brother to behave honestly. Our interactions remained polite but superficial, cordial enough for family gatherings but lacking any real warmth or mutual respect. I found I could live with Sarah's continued rejection more easily than I'd expected. Her approval had always been conditional on my willingness to absorb mistreatment without complaint, and I was no longer willing to meet those conditions. If she chose to maintain that dynamic rather than developing a more respectful relationship with me, that was her decision to make and her loss to live with. Richard continued his pattern of strategic neutrality, treating family conflicts as weather systems to be waited out rather than problems to be addressed. I no longer expected anything different from him or felt particularly disappointed by his passivity. He was who he'd always been, and accepting that reality freed me from the futile effort of trying to get support from someone who'd never been willing to provide it. But Tyler, my youngest grandson, began reaching out to me more frequently as he witnessed the positive changes in both his father's behavior and my own confidence and happiness. At 20 years old, he was beginning to understand family dynamics in more sophisticated ways and seemed to appreciate having a grandmother who was thriving rather than just surviving. "Grandma," he told me during one of his visits, "you seem really different lately. Happier, I guess. More like yourself." "More like myself," I repeated thoughtfully. "I think you're right. I'd forgotten who I was when I wasn't worried about everyone else all the time." "Dad says you've been going to art classes and stuff. That's really cool." "Pottery classes," I corrected with a smile. "And yes, I love them. Have you ever worked with clay?" "No, but it sounds awesome. Do you think I could try it sometime?" "I would love that," I told him genuinely. "Elena and I go every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. You're welcome to join us anytime you want." These conversations with Tyler reminded me why I'd fought so hard to rebuild my relationships with family members who were willing to treat me with respect. Not everyone was capable of change, but some people were, and those relationships were worth the patient work required to rebuild them on healthier foundations. 1 year after that first confrontation with the receipts spread across my coffee table, I found myself sitting on the small balcony of my apartment as the sun set over the Manhattan skyline. The city sparkled below me with thousands of lights, each one representing someone living their own complex story of challenge and growth and survived disappointments. I held a glass of Shiraz, not expensive wine, but a bottle I'd chosen simply because I liked the taste and wanted to celebrate my own survival. The past no longer felt like chains dragging me down but like broken glass I'd walked through barefoot and somehow emerged from whole and stronger. The memories I'd once feared, the loneliness, the betrayal, the financial abuse, the gaslighting, had become milestones on my path to freedom instead of sources of shame and self-doubt. Each painful experience had taught me something valuable about my own worth and strength, lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. My bank account was modest but secure, no longer drained by someone else's irresponsible spending. My days were full but not frantic, filled with activities I'd chosen for my own enjoyment rather than obligations designed to earn someone else's approval. My relationships were fewer in number but far higher in quality, based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. Most importantly, I'd learned to enjoy my own company in ways I'd never imagined possible. The woman staring back at me from mirrors now was someone I genuinely liked and respected, not perfect, certainly, but worthy of love and care and consideration from others and from herself. As darkness settled over the city and the first stars became visible through the urban glow, I raised my glass in a silent toast to the journey that had brought me to this moment. To the courage it had taken to stand up for myself when everything in my history told me to keep silent and keep giving. To the friends who'd supported me through the transformation. To the son who'd been willing to do the difficult work of change. To the peace I'd found in my own heart after decades of chaos. But mostly, I toasted to the future, to the years ahead that belonged to me now, to be filled with whatever brought me joy and meaning and growth. I was 74 years old, and I was just beginning to discover who I really was when I wasn't defined by other people's needs and expectations. If you've sat in silence, feeling invisible in your own life, or if you know someone trapped in the painful cycle of giving everything while receiving nothing in return, I want you to remember something: it's never too late to matter in your own story. It's never too late to say no to people who take your love for granted. It's never too late to choose yourself with the same fierce devotion you've spent years offering to others. The scariest step is the first one, the moment when you stop accepting unacceptable behavior because you're afraid of being alone. But on the other side of that fear lives a peace and self-respect that no one can take away from you once you claim it for yourself. Love yourself enough to demand respect. Love yourself enough to walk away from people who see you as expendable. Love yourself enough to build a life that brings you joy instead of just serving other people's happiness at the expense of your own. You deserve to matter. You deserve to be treated with kindness. You deserve to keep some of your resources, financial, emotional, and spiritual, for your own well-being instead of giving everything away to people who never learned to appreciate what they received. Have you ever lived through something like this, or known someone who found the courage to reclaim their life after years of being taken for granted? I want to hear your stories. Please share your experiences in the comments below, and if this story touched something in your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these stories with people who need to hear them. Together, we can remind each other that it's never too late for a new beginning, and that sometimes the best chapters of our lives are the ones we write for ourselves.